One of the big talking points of 2016 was Angela Merkel's decision to let in the migrants. If you cast your mind back to when it began, the spin was that Germany had a demographic deficit and needed more babies, or perhaps you believed the one about the refugees being doctors and nurses and highly educated. But most important, and perhaps the only meme that still gets repeated these days, is that it was a sign that Germany was coming to terms with its past, by which I am assuming people are referring to the Holocaust and not to the largely underreported situation in German-occupied areas during World War I, which was not that dissimilar to what happened in World War II. But regardless, 1 million or so crimes later, the mass rapes in Cologne, several terror attacks and others thwarted, and billions of euros spent, Mrs. Merkel is still in charge and being blamed for letting him in after every new atrocity, while she imprisons people for saying stuff on Facebook and suggests banning the burqa. This is clearly a political situation, but in a sense it is also an historical question, and like all historical questions, it is a matter of where one chooses to start. For instance, one could begin with the Kaiser and that speech he gave about Germany being the protector of Muslims, something that alarmed the British and led them to seek an alliance with France. But that is rather obscure and too distant. So I will point to a number of more recent events. The first being the US tapping of Mrs. Merkel's phone, the second being the proposed Asia to Europe high-speed rail link with its terminus in Berlin, the third Germany's trade deals with Russia, particularly the gas deals, and last but not least how the second and the third would have annoyed the Americans, particularly in light of what their spies may have heard when listening in on the tapped phone calls of the first. Oh, and a little reported story about Germany wanting the Americans to vacate one of their military bases. The Germans balked at the price that they would have to pay for losing American protection. I don't recall the exact figure, but it was a good few months of the refugee budget. The matter was resolved amicably with stories about how much the local economy benefited by having Americans protecting Germany. Oh, and before I forget, if you recall around the time that supposedly Frau Merkel woke up one day and decided to culturally enrich the German nation by way of atonement, that horsewoman of the apocalypse, Victoria Nudelman, was accidentally overheard saying, "Fuck the EU." And if you are going to fuck the EU, then who better to shaft than the Germans? If one reads the wilder parts of the interwebs, it is not long before the name of George Soros crops up, along with dark tales of Esperanto, his desire to relive the happiest year of his life, and his supposedly giving Mrs. Merkel brown envelopes to fulfill his dreams of open borders. And along with the Dark Lord comes Hillary Lucifer Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, and her connection via the State Department to the horsewoman of the apocalypse, Victoria Nuland Kagan. At which point you can take the conspiracy theory in two directions. Either the Germans are in on the game and are benefiting from the US sanctions on Russia, with the migrants being useful in securing engineering contracts with the companies from which they came, via the rubberlise and rebuild method of diplomacy, or they are not, and the Germans are being hit both by the migrants and the sanctions on Russia. Either way, it doesn't matter, because the Americans have got what they want, which is a Europe without Russia, and plenty of chaos to justify why they need all those troops in Europe to keep the peace. And if anyone in America begins wondering if the military spending is justified, you can rely on Victoria Nuland to roll into town to spread war, pestilence and famine with every donut. Now, obviously, the crime wave that followed in the wake of the migrants wasn't supposed to happen, or maybe it was, but regardless, what was certainly not meant to happen was those keeping tabs on the crime wave were not meant to notice that the category of migrants most likely to sexually assault teenage girls are from Pakistan. What also is not mentioned much these days is talk of the Russians and Chinese seeking to undermine the dollar by setting up their own alternative currency for the trading of oil and ultimately as a reserve currency for all trade. And certainly no one, in their right mind, talks about the euro in such terms anymore. So the US can safely go on printing money, and the bankers can get their 4% or whatever it is of each note printed. And the great thing is that these days they don't even have to spend the money on ink and paper to get their cut. They can issue it electronically, which is nice.